Hey friends, I'm Jake. I'm a developer advocate here at Figma, and we are so excited that you're here. Before we really dig in, I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about design systems and how we can think of them as building blocks for efficient, design-informed product development. So context is everything. And when we talk about development workflows and dev mode, we really want to be thinking about it as how do you describe your design intent to the people that you're collaborating with, as well as the tools that they're using. Now, we're very familiar with design systems in Figma. A lot of you are very familiar with these concepts, but here's some named abstractions that we have inside of Figma. We have things like variables, right? Which are like the design tokens you have in your system. Those values can change between themes, whether they're colors or sizes or text values. Then we also have components, right? Which are kind of those reusable elements that have component properties. Those can exist inside of Figma and code as well. And then we have styles. Sometimes we talk about these like they're composite tokens, right? Styles are many tokens described by one idea, something like a box shadow or a text style. Those are all kind of the named abstraction design patterns that we have in Figma. But you also have a lot of other ones that sit inside of your code base and are kind of implied in Figma. So you also have abstractions around layout. How do you think about grid systems, responsiveness? Are you using Flexbox? Are you using absolute position? A lot of teams have named abstractions there. We also have how do you think about usage guidelines and how do you describe your libraries and what sorts of naming conventions are shared across components? There's all sorts of things there that you build patterns around. But then on the engineering side, we also talk about content and state and how do we build patterns around the way things work and the way things are filled with data and the way we store data in the back end and how we refer to that data, the schema. And so it's important to be thinking about all of these things when we're talking about implementing something that has been designed inside of Figma. We're going to be talking about dev mode today, and dev mode is a dedicated space inside of Figma with the developer perspective in mind, and designers come into it to work with developers to efficiently take ideas from design to production. How you do things inside of dev mode, and we're going to get to some examples of this in just a second. We have Codebase context inside of Figma. So Figma isn't just a place to only think about design, it's also a place to associate some of those things that are in Figma with things that are in code. And there's a couple different ways we can talk about it. One that you may have heard of is Code Connect, and we'll show some examples of this later. But this is a way to document your components in Figma with their component code that's coming from the code base. So Code Connect snippets are these dynamic snippets that show the production form of the designed component inside of dev mode. Now we also supply this over MCP to agentic workflows, which we'll talk about. And there's a lot of really cool ways in which Code Connect snippets can be utilized, whether it's visually like this or in kind of like a developer's coding workflow. Now we also have a new way to do Code Connect that is a little bit lower lift for a wider amount of connections. It doesn't get in depth to the same degree that Code Connect snippets do, but it allows you inside of Figma to quickly map your library to the relevant files in the code base. And this little relationship between a component in Figma and a file in the code base can actually be really important and helpful in agentic coding workflows. And so we have Code Connect UI that allows you to do these sorts of mappings really easily. And it's just another example of the different ways we're bringing connections to the code base into Figma. There's a lot more to come here with features like this, but I did want to preview this for y'all, and I can show what this looks like in a little bit. Last but not least, I want to call out variable code syntax. So for your teams that are using variables, you can actually supply the code form of those variables inside of Figma. In this case, we have a token that's called background default secondary hover, and it has different values in different modes. This kind of sentence case form of it is really helpful inside of Figma as well as the groups. But in the code base, you might actually add a prefix and maybe have the word color as a prefix in addition to the design system abbreviation or something, right? You might have a very specific form of this in your code base that might not be one-to-one with how it's kind of named inside of Figma. So what we allow you to do with code syntax is for web, iOS and Android supply different code syntaxes for your variables so that your developers see the exact representation of the variable when they're inspecting it in Figma and when we're providing this metadata to LLMs through our MCP server. All right, so let's take a peek at what this looks like inside of Figma. All right, so here we are. We have a design. We're using a design system. This is a clone of our simple design system, which is a design system that sits in Figma, and there's a React code representation of it. That's what we're going to be using today to kind of do this demo. Now, we see that in the design system, we have a bunch of text styles. So those are over here. All these values are bound to variables. If we want to take a peek at all the variables, we can open up this little control panel. This is the typography collection, but we could also look at color. We see a bunch of different demo variables in here. I can click on this and see that code syntax we were talking about earlier and how that's been added to these variables. And so our system's set up, ready to go. We also have a bunch of components, but let's just talk for a second about what we do before we hand it off to developers. We've created these comps, they're using the design system, and we've also brought in annotations, right? And so for example, I've created an annotation with a content category that says, hey, this content for this FAQ is stored in the CMS. We can also just write arbitrary annotations and map specific properties. In this case, we're calling out the fill color. We can also do things like call out the direction of the auto layout. We could do the gap. You know, if there's any specific properties we wanted to reference, we can call that out. So you could also call out, you know, the variant of the component. Now, in addition to that, these are rich text. So we see some bold text here, but we could do this, right, and italicize. And so you have the ability to kind of like write a headline. We can end up doing a whole bunch of rich text stuff here. Okay, there's a lot of rich context inside of Figma, and sometimes you want to pull out specific things. So a good way to think about annotations is to either call out specific things that might get lost in the context of the design, or to provide information that wouldn't otherwise be provided, right? So in this case, we have an image background. In this case, I'm using an annotation to say, hey, this asset is in our brand approved drive, you know, and reference a specific image. Think of annotations as a way to bring a bunch of different context to what you're going to hand off to your developers. Now that we're ready to hand this off to developers, we can actually select this section here and we can mark this as ready for dev. One cool feature about Figma AI is we actually detect opportunities for you to improve this design before handing it off. One thing that we know is that metadata about the design is really important, whether it's a developer looking at it or the LLMs and the tools that they're using. And one of those pieces of metadata is the name of layers, right? And so we always talk about naming your layers. And in this case, when we mark this as ready for dev, Figma AI has detected that there's a couple layers in here that might be worth a name. And I'm just going to go ahead and allow Figma to name those for me. That's great. Thank you so much. And so now we know that everything in here is kind of like past a little bit of an audit. We know that we've kind of trued this up and it's ready to be consumed by our developer counterparts and the tools they're using. Before we switch into dev mode here, I want to call out this ready for dev view that's right here. When we click on this view as a developer, we look at this massive file with a ton of pages in a different view. This view only shows things that have been marked as ready for dev in a timeline orientation. This is a lot easier for developers to consume. If you think about it, like these design files that we create can be massive and have a whole bunch of context in them. And sometimes it can be easy to get lost what is and isn't important. This timeline view allows developers to consume it in those terms. And when they click on one of these, they're put in the focus view, which is scoped to just the section in this case that was marked as ready for dev. They could do different things like, you know, take a peek at it in dark mode, right? We get all this nice little features around this kind of dedicated environment. Within here, we have the inspect panel as well. I'm going to go back to dev mode, but before I do, I'm going to call out our plugin ecosystem here. So you can run plugins in the inspect panel, and one I want to call out is the Jira plugin. So for teams that use tools like Jira, they can actually run these things directly inside. We could create an issue. Let me see what's going on with this one here. We can load an issue. We can change the status directly inside of the plugin. We can go back and see what else is on that page. So I'm going to go ahead and select this Tailwind one here and see how this does. So plugins like this actually show code directly inside of the panel itself. CodeGen plugins can render code directly inside of the inspect panel, but then some other plugins like we were just looking at with Jira can open up an entire user interface inside of this inspect panel. So let's actually go directly to this on the page, and we'll find ourselves back in the world of our nice, messy file, right? So remember, the infinite canvas is your opportunity to kind of explore and really figure out what it is you're making, and it prioritizes exploration, but your developers like to stay focused. So we're going to land back on the canvas, and I'm going to switch into dev mode, clicking this toggle down here. We'll go back to the inspect panel. We see that same inspect panel we were looking at earlier. I'm actually going to switch the language we're looking at to CSS for a second, and I'm going to click on this section. Now we get a whole bunch of information in here, and I'm going to start at the bottom. So we see that we can export this entire thing as a ping image if we wanted to. We can change the resolution of the export. We also have other export options down here, from SVG to PDF, JPEG, etc., depending on what it is we're trying to export. We also see that it's surfacing some icons and some assets that we might want to export as SVGs. We also see selection colors categorized by what they're being applied to. And then we also see CSS here. We see code syntax that represents the way it's defined in the code base, and that's pulled out right here. For colors, I'll click on this one here. We get to see kind of how it's inherited, right? So this color has been aliased to another color. And so we can see how we arrived here based on the mode. We could switch to dark mode and see how that alias changes. I'm now going to select this component, and we'll get to see Code Connect inline, right? So if we select an individual accordion item, we see the Code Connect for that. We get a link to GitHub where this component is described. And then when I select the greater accordion, we get to see all of those rendered fully kind of recursively as a React code snippet here. So Code Connect is really cool because it allows you to bring that code base context you have inside of Figma, so your developers are actually getting really relevant previews of the code representation of the design. An example of like how this can actually be pretty nuanced is this is going to be a component we're going to be using today in this demo, but this is a pricing card. And oftentimes like this sort of a component is called like a vanity component or a wrapping component, where we've basically said, even though there's a ton of instances inside of here, we're creating a very flat component structure for representing this thing. But because all of these components are documented with Code Connect, I can actually come in here and select like I'll select this text list, and the text list itself can be looked at individually. Or this button, we can see how to implement this button if we ever wanted to implement a button this way. But at a high level for the pricing card, if we want to see this is all we need to provide, right? And so depending on what you're doing as an engineer, maybe we're looking at this navigation pill list. There are different reasons why an engineer might be interested in diving in or zooming out when they're inspecting with Code Connect. Now, to make Code Connect work, we're going to switch over to the code base. And in here we can see, I'm in VS Code right now. This is what a Code Connect doc looks like. So this Code Connect template sits in the code base alongside all of our components. So in here, I also have my UI library. We could see that button component is described right here. So this is the React definition of our button component in our code base. Here's the CSS. And then up here, I've actually put the Figma Code Connect template so that this gets published to Figma and associated with Figma, and that's how it ends up generating those relevant Code Connect snippets. The one we were just looking at was accordion. It's pretty simple. Here's the one that does the accordion, and then here's the one that does those accordion items. So it's pretty straightforward. What it does is it maps Figma information right here to whatever we want it to turn into in code, and then we spit it out down here as a template. We don't need to get into the weeds here. I just wanted to show you kind of how that ends up working. What your engineer would do to kind of publish this up to Figma is they would end up saying npx Figma Connect publish. And what that does is it'll look for all the Code Connect in the code base, publish it up to the Figma library, and that's how you end up getting this result where these end up showing up dynamically, right? So this is going to change based on which of these I have selected, and that's all described by these dynamic Code Connect docs in the code base. In addition to those Code Connect dynamic snippets that we were just looking at, we have a new feature feature that allows you to connect your Codebase to Figma at a shallower but wider level. And that's the Code Connect UI. I'm going to give you a quick preview of this. The way that it works is you can come in here, you go to the library, and you can say connect components to code. And this is going to look for all the components that are described in the current file. And we can see that I've already connected a whole bunch of them. But the way that it works is you select one and you can actually authenticate with GitHub, or you can manually provide these references. This allows you to search the Codebase if you have GitHub connected, and when you can map these things to specific definitions in your Codebase. And we pull in all that definition code right here so that you can see it and reference it. But when we go back, you can do this pretty quickly with your entire library. It was able to automatically connect a lot of my icon library, and we can see that it's been connected right here. That's how you connect that. And what that ends up giving you is the ability to look over here at, how many components are in this current selection, how many have been connected. We can click view connections and see here are the relevant components. We could dig in and get more details here that are Codebase relevant. So that's the Code Connect UI. That's a really cool addition to how we're bringing some of this Codebase context inside of Figma, allowing you to configure that relationship more easily depending on your needs. All right, before we talk about how engineers are going to actually code this stuff now that they have access to it, I want to spend a second to talk about AI and code generation and how Figma fits into those workflows. All right, so we all know that LLMs are actually really good at writing code. They've been trained on massive corpuses of code bases. They can write code any way you could ever want them to. The problem is getting them to write code the way you want them to. And that's where there's a lot of variability. And that's where agentic coding tools come into play. Whether this is something like Claude, Cursor, Copilot in VS Code, Windsurf, there's a bunch of different coding tools out there. And what they do is they provide the context in your code base, which is where you write your code, to the LLMs so that when they write code the way you do. The only way an LLM is going to write code the way I write code is if it knows how I write code, right? And all of that information sits in the code base. Now, when we talk about creating code for a design, a huge part of that is understanding what sort of code you should be writing, right? And that's what are we trying to make? And that sits inside of Figma. And that's where Figma's MCP server comes in. So Figma's MCP server provides LLMs access to what's been designed in Figma, and inside of that is also that Codebase context like Code Connect, variables code syntax, and Figma is in the position of being able to say, here's what we're trying to make, here are the pieces that are going to be involved in doing that, here's the relevant Codebase context, and then the LLM can use that alongside its understanding of the rest of the Codebase to write production grade UI code. So that's how Figma fits into these workflows. That's how the MCP server kind of allows LLMs to get into that. And we're going to do a demo of this in a second, but the way that it essentially works is your developer clicks something in Figma that they want to implement. Then they go into their coding tool. In this case, I'm using VS Code and Copilot. And I'm saying, hey, get the current design in Figma and help me implement it. And what the LLM ends up doing is it ends up going out to Figma, getting all of that relevant context for the current selection, and then it comes back and it uses that to actually implement that correct front-end code. So that's what we're going to demo right now, and I'm really excited to show you. All right, so here we have a design. We're using our design system, and we want to go ahead and implement this section. Now, before I go too much further, I actually want to make a quick shout out to Make. So if we think about a section like this, there's a lot of implied complexity. We have a toggle for monthly and yearly. Presumably that's going to change these cards. What happens if the user's already on one of these plans? Does the button content change? And this is all an example, an oversimplified example of like things a designer has to think through. And traditionally you do something like this, right? You end up pulling stuff out, connecting it with noodles, describing all these different states as a part of your design. And this is still valid for a lot of different use cases. But a really cool feature of Figma Make is the ability to actually paste in that design and test it out and bring it to life. So here I've actually brought this to life inside of Figma Make as a designer, and I can see what this experience looks like when this is the current plan. What does that look like when you're in monthly, right? How does this change the button text? You can also generate UI around your UI to kind of like create some controls, right? And this is just an example of how you can use something like Figma Make to kind of work with your idea, really uncover what this is that you're trying to design, design, the experience you're trying to make. And you can either hand this off to your developer. They can access this with MCP, but sometimes you want to actually simplify how you're communicating this. And that's actually a great opportunity for annotations. So in this example workflow, what we've done is we've done a design, we've explored it in Make, and then we've come back and we've actually just written 2 pretty concise annotations to describe the feature. That's also a perfectly valid way to think about how you're going to communicate this to your developer. So we've selected this section. Inside of it, we have a bunch of Code Connect on all these components. We're using variables. We can see right here, variables are in context. We see these variables on the canvas. That's another example of Codebase context coming into our inspection flow. And when I scroll up here, we're going to see this little MCP server section. And this is going to actually estimate how many tokens, which is almost, think of it like how many characters, how big is the message going to be that gets sent over to LLMs. We get a little estimation of that right here. And our MCP server is enabled. We have a bunch of different options for how it should think about images when it sends images over. We're going to have more settings in here over time and things like that. But we're selecting this and we're going to hop on over to the Codebase. I'm going to open up the Codebase here, and here's our demo. And when I type hello world in our demo and I save it and I switch over to my browser, we see hello world shows up here, right? So in this example, we want to take this section and have it use all of our Codebase components and put it inside of here. This is an oversimplified example, I know, but I think this is going to give you a good sense for what this workflow looks like for your engineers. So I'm going to hop into Copilot. This is GitHub Copilot inside of VS Code. I'm currently using Claude Sonnet 4 and I'm in agent mode, and I've installed the Figma MCP server. Now this is all going to look a little bit different whether or not your engineers are using VS Code or whether or not you're an engineer and you're using, I don't know, Cursor or whatever it is. But inside of Copilot, I can actually list my servers. I can see that I've got a couple servers in here. I can list the Figma server. I can see, I can restart it here. Oftentimes that's helpful if I'm looking to update the server or do anything like that. I've restarted my server. We're ready to use it. There's a bunch of tools on the server that we can reference. If I click this tools icon in Copilot, I can actually see our MCP server, our Figma MCP server. Here are all the tools and their descriptions. These are going to change over time. We're going to look at a couple today. The names might change. We're still in beta right now, but we have a whole bunch of tools that the LLM can actually use to access Figma. So I'm going to close this and we're going to say, implement my Figma selection in demo.tsx. And this is a way to refer to specific files inside of Copilot that changes based on your IDE. So I'm going to tell it to do that. It's using some references. It's using instructions. These are like cursor rules, if you've heard of that concept before, to kind of like get a good sense of what's going on. I've specifically configured GitHub Copilot to go through a specific sequence whenever I want it to implement Figma. So the first thing it's going to do is it's asking to get metadata from Figma. So it got a bunch of high-level metadata for our current selection. This shows the frames and instances that we have selected. And now it's going to ask me to get a screenshot. I'm going to say, go right ahead. We can see that it got this image screenshot from Figma. That's fantastic. So now it knows what this looks like visually. Now it's going to get the Code Connect map when I confirm here. And that's going to return all of those Code Connect snippets that are relevant for this specific selection. We can see those in here. We see the navigation. We're going to see those pricing cards in here as well, the text list, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's going to use the get variable defs tool. When I hit continue here, that's going to show all of the relevant variables in their code syntax for the current selection. That's important context. And last but not least, it's going to get code. And get code is going to return a React and Tailwind representation of the design. That's also going to have variables in it. It's also going to have the Code Connect in it. So those are all the tools that I've told Copilot to use whenever we're going to access stuff from Figma. Now, depending on your task as an engineer, you might want some of these, you might prioritize some over others depending on what you're doing. And we can see that it's doing a pretty quick implementation here already to implement these pricing cards. And we could see it's using all the right components. It's going to work through some TypeScript errors here, I think. It's making sure that the APIs are working. It's going to correct the props. Great. So it learned how to do the right thing. It's going to go ahead and convert some numbers to strings. Make sure that all of that is working. Okay. I'm going to hit keep as soon as it's done telling us how good of a job it did. All right, so it's generated this code. So it's gone in and it's implemented. It's connected to our data layer. And when we come over here, we can actually see how this feels and what this behavior actually translates to. From this point, we know it's using the right things. It's pulled in the right components. It's mapped to our data layer. We can go ahead and take this and actually properly implement the feature without having to get lost in the details of making sure we're using all of the right UI components and that sort of a thing. One thing I want to call out is the importance of also documenting in the Codebase how to use the design system. So I have Copilot instructions in here that give an overview of my library, some implementation guidelines. This is also important in addition to the context that Figma is providing about what pieces are required for the current task. All right, before we go, let's talk about some best practices for using Figma and using our MCP server and dev mode. This is ultimately where you get to supply your expertise to get better outcomes. So from the top, most importantly, design consideration is important. Design consideration is where you want to spend your time. You want to spend your time thinking about better experiences, going further, not just faster. And once you do that, you want to make sure that those decisions make their way into production. But in order to get good outputs on the other end, you need precise and potent inputs. And Figma can provide those inputs to LLMs for better code generation. So what that looks like for you also requires a little bit of curiosity about pursuing the different things that would be most beneficial for LLMs to understand to do the right thing. Now here's some practical best practices. So just remember that design patterns are very machine readable. So document and adopt design patterns. Think about them with modern developer tools in mind. The more you stick to the system, the better outcomes you're going to get, both from an efficiency perspective and quality. Leverage the MCP server for more than UI generation. Design context can be used to do tons of things, right? You could get the metadata about a bunch of screens and say, help me project plan how I'm going to go about implementing this. You could select a big thing and say, how many of these things are using components the right way based on what we have in the code base and how many aren't. You can do all sorts of things, whether it's auditing your design tokens or whatever using the MCP server. Don't just think of the MCP server as a way to make whatever's in Figma. You can also think about it as from an engineering perspective about how to better plan and kind of like do the engineering work around the idea of UI development. Also, instruct your agents. So provide agentic coding tools with context about your specific implementation details at a workspace level. This is the best place to apply your expertise. Don't just set it and forget it. Make sure that you're providing specific context. You're telling the agents how to think about these problems, how to interpret what Figma is going to give it. All of those things are critical if you want to get good outcomes with AI tools. Last but not least, annotate design intent. If you're a designer and you're like, how can I help developers like understand this or their tools do a better job? Use annotations as a machine readable format to kind of like really describe the idea of what it is you're making. Not everything you're making is just visual, right? It's a sequence. It's thinking about the user's experience. How can you describe that in a way so that an LLM is going to get a good understanding of what you're trying to convey? Some resources if you're interested. The simple design system that we were demonstrating here is up on GitHub at Figma/SDS. Simple design system is a React and Figma library that has Code Connect on it. You can use it to kind of like be a starter design system if you want to, or you could just use it for good references for how to bring some of these ideas to your design system. There's also Storybook in there. There's also some integrations that show how to use the REST API for variables to like sync design tokens, all sorts of little examples like that might help unblock you in whatever situation you're in. Simple Design System also has a stencil representation thanks to our friends over at OneNorth, which is an agency. They created a design system that documents web components, Vue, Angular forms of the library as well. So if you use one of those other web frameworks, that might be helpful. There's Code Connect in there to kind of show you how that would look if you're interested in those APIs. Last but not least, check out figma.com/developers. That's going to be the best place to visit if you're a developer and you want to learn more about our APIs, or the best thing to share with your team internally when they're investigating the different features that Figma has and the different APIs that they can use. So you can learn more about the MCP server there. You can learn more about Code Connect, how to set that stuff up, plugin APIs, REST APIs. We've got a whole bunch of resources out there, so check them out. Thank you so much. Again, I'm Jake. I work on the advocacy team at Figma. Advocates are always here to hear from you about what you need and how we can take that feedback, bring it internally so that we can make sure that Figma is offering as much value for your workflows as we can.